Eleutheria, the Greek word for freedom. Chapter 53. When the Italians invaded Greece in 1940, I had already decided that I would not run away. I cannot tell you why. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was indifference. And here on a remote corner of a remote island, it did not require great courage. The Germans took over from the Italians on April 6, 1941. By April 27th, they were in Athens. In June, they started the invasion of Crete. And for a time, we were in the thick of the war. Transport airplanes passed over all day long. German landing craft filled the harbors. But after the peace, soon alighted back on the island. It had no strategic value either to the Axis or to the resistance. The garrison here was very small. 40 Austrians. The Nazis gave the Austrians and the Italians all the easy occupation posts, commanded by a lieutenant who had been wounded during the invasion of France. Already, during the invasion of Crete, I had been ordered out of Verona. A permanent lookout section was posted here, and the maintenance of this observation point was the real reason we had a garrison at all. Fortunately, I had the house in the village. The Germans were not unpleasant. They carried all my portable possessions over there for me and even paid me a small billeting rent for Verona. Then, just when things were settling down, it happened that the Proedros, the mayor of the village that year, had a fatal thrombosis. 2 days later, I was summoned to meet the newly arrived commandant of the island. He and his men were installed in your school, which had been closed since Christmas. I was expecting to meet some promoted quartermaster type of officer. Instead, I found myself with a very handsome young man of 27 or 8, who said in excellent French that he understood I could speak the language fluently. He was extremely polite, more than a little apologetic, and inasmuch as one can in such circumstances, we took to each other. He soon came to the point. He wanted me to be the new mayor of the village. I refused at once. I wanted no involvement in the war. He then sent out for 2 or 3 of the leading villagers. When they came, he left me alone with them, and I discovered that it was they who had proposed my name. Of course, the fact was that none of them wanted the job, the odium of collaboration, and I was the ideal bouc émissaire. They put the matter to me in highly moral and complimentary terms, and I still refused. Then they were frank, promised their tacit support. In short, in the end I said, "Very well, I will do it." My new but dubious glory meant that I came into frequent contact with Lieutenant Kluber. 5 or 6 weeks after our first meeting, he said one evening that he would like me also to call him Anton when we were alone. That will tell you that we often were alone and that we had confirmed our liking of each other. Our first link was through music. He had a fine tenor voice. Like many gifted amateurs, he sang Schubert and Wolf better, in some way more feelingly, than any but the very greatest professional lieder singers. That is, to my ear. On his very first visit to my house, he saw my harpsichord, and rather maliciously I played him the Goldberg variations. If one wishes to reduce a sensitive German to tears, there is no surer lacrimatory. I must not suggest that Anton was a hard subject to conquer. He was more than disposed to be ashamed of his role and to find a convenient anti-Nazi figure to worship. The next time I visited the school, he begged me to accompany him at the school piano, which he had had moved to his quarters. Then it was my turn to be sentimentally impressed. Not to tears, of course, but he sang very well, and I have always had a softness for Schubert. One of the first things I wanted to know was why Anton, with his excellent French, was not in occupied France. It seemed certain compatriots considered him not sufficiently German in his attitude to the French. No doubt he had spoken once too often in the mess in defense of Gallic culture, and that was why he had been relegated to this backwater. I forgot to say he had been shot in the kneecap during the 1940 invasion and had a limp, unfitting him for active military duties. He was German, not Austrian. His family was rich, and he had spent a year before the war studying at the Sorbonne. Finally, he had decided that he would become an architect, but of course his training was interrupted by the war. He stopped and turned up the lamp, then, opening the file, unfolded a large plan, 2 or 3 sketches, perspectives and elevations, all glass and glittering concrete. He was very rude about this house, and he promised he would come back after the war and build me something new, after the best Bauhaus principles. All the notes were written in French, not a word of German anywhere. The plan was signed Anton Kluber, le 7 juin, l'an 4 de la Grande Folie. He let me look a few moments longer, then he turned down the lamp again. For a year during the occupation, everything was tolerable. We were very short of food, but Anton and his men shut their eyes to countless irregularities. The idea that the occupation was all a matter of jackbooted stormtroopers and solid natives is absurd. Most of the Austrian soldiers were over 40 and fathers themselves, easy meat for the village children. One summer dawn in 1942, an Allied plane came and torpedoed a German supply landing craft that had anchored in the old harbor on its way to Crete. It sank. Hundreds of crates of food came bobbing to the surface. By then the islanders had had a year of nothing but fish and bad bread. The sight of all this meat, milk, rice, and other luxuries was too much. They swarmed out in anything that would float. Somebody told me what was happening, and I hurried down to the harbor. The garrison had a machine gun on the point. It had fired furiously at the Allied plane, and I had terrible visions of a revengeful massacre. But when I got there, I saw islanders busily hauling in crates not 100 yards from where the machine gun was. Outside the post stood Anton and the duty section. Not a shot was fired. Later that morning, Anton summoned me. Of course, I thanked him profusely. He said that he was going to report that several of the crew of the landing craft had been saved by the prompt action of the villagers who had rowed to their help. He must now have a few crates handed back to show as salvage. I was to see to that. The rest would be considered sunk and destroyed. What little hostility that remained against him and his men among the villagers disappeared. I remember one evening, it must have been about a month before that, a group of Austrian soldiers, a little drunk, began to sing down by the harbor, and then suddenly the islanders began to sing as well, in turn, first the Austrians, then the islanders, German and Greek, a Tyrolean carol, then a Calamatiano. It was very strange. In the end, they were all singing each other's songs. But that was the zenith of our small golden age. Somewhere among the Austrian soldiers there must have been a spy. About a week after the singing, a section of German troops was added to Anton's garrison to stiffen morale. He came to me one day like an angry child and said, "I have been told I am in danger of becoming a discredit to the Wehrmacht. I must mend my ways." His troops were forbidden to give food to the islanders, and we saw them far less frequently in the village. In November of that year, the Gorgopotamus exploit created a new strain. Fortunately, I had been given more credit than I deserved by the villagers for the easiness of the regime, and they accepted the stricter situation as well as could be expected. Conchis stopped speaking, then clapped his hands twice. "I should like you to see Anton." "I think I've seen him already." "No, Anton is dead. You have seen an actor who looks like him. But this is the real Anton. During the war, I had a small cinecamera and 2 reels of film, which I kept until 1944 when I could get them developed. The quality is very poor." I heard the faint whir of a projector. A beam of light came from above, was adjusted, centered on the screen, a blur, hasty focusing. I saw a handsome young man of about my own age. He was not the one I had seen the week before, though in one feature, the heavy dark eyebrows, they were very similar. But this was unmistakably a wartime officer. He didn't look particularly soft, but more like a Battle of Britain pilot, stylishly insouciant. He was walking down a path beside a high wall, the wall of Hermes Ambellis's house, perhaps. Smiling, he struck a sort of heroic tenor attitude, laughed self-consciously, and abruptly the 10-second sequence was over. In the next, he was drinking coffee, playing with a cat at his feet, looked sideways up at the camera, a serious, shy look, as if someone had told him not to smile. The film was very fuzzy, jerky, amateurish. Another sequence. A file of men marching round the island harbor, apparently shot from above, out of some upper-story window. This is Anton in the rear. He had a slight limp. And I also knew that I was for a moment watching the unfakeable truth. Beyond the men I could see a broad quay on which there stood the little island customs and Coast Guard house. I knew it had been built since the war. On this film the quay was bare. The beam was extinguished. There, I took other scenes, but one reel deteriorated. Those were all I could salvage. He paused, then went on. The officer responsible for stiffening morale in this area of Greece was an SS colonel called Wimmel, Dietrich Wimmel. By the time I am now speaking of, resistance movements had begun in Greece, wherever the terrain permitted. Among the islands, of course, only Crete allowed Maquis operations. But up in the north and over there in the Peloponnesus, ELAS and the other groups had begun to organize themselves. Arms were dropped to them, trained saboteurs. Wimmel was brought to Nauplia late in 1942 from Poland, where he had had a great deal of success. He was responsible for the southwest of Greece, in which we were included. His technique was simple. He had a price list. For every German wounded, 10 hostages were executed. For every German killed, 20. As you may imagine, it was a system that worked. He had a hand-picked company of Teutonic monsters under him who did the interrogating, torturing, executing, and the rest. They were known after the badge they wore as Die Raben, the Ravens. I met him before his infamies had become widely known. I heard one winter morning that a German motor launch had unexpectedly brought an important officer to the island. Later that day, Anton sent for me. In his office, I was introduced to a small, thin man, my own height, my own age, immaculately neat, scrupulously polite. He stood to shake my hand. He spoke some English, enough to know that I spoke it much better than he did. And when I confessed that I had many cultural attachments to England, had been partly educated there, he said, "The great tragedy of our time is that England and Germany should have quarreled." Anton explained that he had told the colonel about our musical evenings, and that the colonel hoped that I would join them for lunch and afterwards accompany Anton in 1 or 2 songs. Of course, I had a titre d'office to accept. I did not like the colonel at all. He had eyes like razors. I think the most unpleasant eyes I have ever seen in a human being. They were without a grain of sympathy for what they saw. Nothing but assessment and calculation. If they had been brutal or lecherous or sadistic, they would have been better. But they were the eyes of a machine, an educated machine. The colonel had brought some bottles of hock with him, and we had the best lunch I had eaten for many months. We discussed the war very briefly, rather as one might discuss the weather. It was the colonel himself who changed the subject to literature. He was obviously a well-read man, knew Shakespeare well, and Goethe and Schiller extremely well. He even drew some interesting parallels between English and German literature, and not all in Germany's favor. I realized that he was drinking less than we were, also that Anton was careless with his tongue. We were both, in fact, being watched. I knew that halfway through the meal, and the colonel knew that I knew it. We two older men polarized the situation. Anton became an irrelevance. The colonel would have had nothing but contempt for the ordinary Greek official, and I was highly honored to be treated by him as a gentleman and equal. But I was not misled. After lunch we performed a few lieder for him, and he was full of compliments. He then announced that he wished to inspect the lookout post on the far side of the island, and invited me to accompany him. The place was of no great military importance, so I traveled round with them in his launch to Moza, and we climbed up to the house here. There was a great deal of military paraphernalia about, wire everywhere, and some pillboxes, but I was happy to find that the house had not been damaged at all. The men were paraded and briefly addressed by the colonel in my presence in German. He referred to me as thin gentleman, and insisted that my property should be respected. But I remember this. As we left, he stopped to correct some minor fault in the way the man on guard at the gate was wearing his equipment. He pointed it out to Anton and said to him, "Schlamperei, Herr Leutnant, sehen Sie?" Now, Schlamperei means something like sloppiness. It is the kind of word Prussians use of Bavarians and of Austrians. He was evidently referring to some previous conversation, but it gave me a key to his character. We did not see him again for 9 months. The autumn of 1943. It was the end of September. I was in my house one beautiful late afternoon when Anton strode in. I knew that something terrible had happened. He had just come back from Barani. About 12 men were stationed there at a time. That morning, 4 who were not on duty had gone down to Moza to swim. They must have grown careless, more schlamperei, because they all got into the water together. They came out one by one and sat throwing a ball and sunning on the beach. Then 3 men stood out of the trees behind them. One had a submachine gun. The Germans had no chance. The Unteroffizier in charge heard the shots from here, the house. Wirelessed Anton, then went down to look. He found 3 corpses and 1 man who lived long enough to say what had happened. The guerrillas had disappeared, and with the soldiers' guns. Anton immediately set out round the island in a launch. Poor Anton! He was torn between doing his duty and trying to delay the news from reaching the dreaded Colonel Wimmel. Of course, he knew that he had to report the incident. He did so, but not until that evening after he had seen me. He told me that morning he had reasoned that he had to deal with Andarte from the mainland, who must have slipped over by night and who would certainly not risk going back again before darkness. He therefore went round the island very slowly, searching every place where a boat might be hidden, and he found one, drawn up in the trees over there at the end of the island, facing Petrocarabi. He had no alternative. The guerrillas must have heard and seen him searching. There were strict high command instructions in such a contingency. One destroyed the means of retreat. He set the boat on fire. The mice were trapped. He had come to explain all this to me. By this time, Wimmel's price list was well known. We owed him 80 men. Anton thought we had one chance to capture the guerrillas and have them waiting for Wimmel when he arrived, as he was almost certain to, the following day. At least we should thus prove that they were not islanders, but agents provocateurs. We knew they must be communists, ELAS men, because their policy was the deliberate instigation of German reprisals in order to stiffen morale on the Greek side. The 18th century Klefts used exactly the same tactics to raise the passive peasantry against the Turks. At 8 that evening, I called all the leading villagers together and explained the situation to them. It was too late to do anything that night. Our only chance was to cooperate with Anton's troops in combing the island the next day. Of course, they were passionately angry at having their peace and their lives put into such jeopardy. They promised to stand guard all night over their boats and cisterns and to be out at dawn to track the guerrillas down. But at midnight I was woken by the sound of marching feet and a knocking at the outside gates. Once again, it was Anton. He came to tell me that it was too late. He had received orders. He was to take no more action on his own initiative. Wimmel would arrive with a company of Die Raben in the morning. I was to be placed under immediate arrest. Every male in the village between the ages of 14 and 75 was to be rounded up at dawn. Anton told me all this in my bedroom. He paced up and down, almost in tears, while I sat on the side of my bed and listened to him say he was ashamed to be German, ashamed to have been born, that he would have killed himself if he did not feel it his duty to try to intercede with the colonel the next day. We talked for a long time. He told me more than he had before about Wimmel. We were so cut off here, and there were many things I had not heard. In the end, he said, "There is one good thing in this war. It has allowed me to meet you." We shook hands. Then I went with him back to the school, where I slept under guard. When I was taken down to the harbor the next morning at 9, all the men and most of the women in the village were there. Anton's troops guarded all the exits. Needless to say, the guerrillas had not been seen. The villagers were in despair, but there was nothing they could do. At 10, Die Raben arrived in a landing craft. One could see at once the difference between them and the Austrians. Better drilled, better disciplined, far better insulated against feelings of humanity, and so young. I found that the most terrifying aspect of them, their fanatical youth. 10 minutes later, a seaplane landed. I remember the shadows of its wings falling on the whitewashed houses, like a black scythe. A young fisherman near me picked a hibiscus and put the blood-red flower against his heart. We all knew what he meant. Wimmel came ashore. The first thing he did was to have all of us men herded onto a quay, and for the first time the islanders knew what it was like to be kicked and struck by foreign troops. The women were driven back into the adjoining streets and alleys. Then Wimmel disappeared into a taverna with Anton. Soon after I was called for. All the villagers crossed themselves, and I was roughly marched in to see him by 2 of his men. He did not stand to greet me, and when he spoke to me, it was as if to a total stranger. He even refused to speak English. He had brought a Greek collaborationist interpreter with him. I could see that Anton was lost. In the shock of the event, he did not know what to do. Wimmel's terms were made known. 80 hostages were to be chosen at once. The rest of the men would comb the island, find the guerrillas, and bring them back with the stolen weapons. It was not sufficient to produce the corpses of 3 brave volunteers. If we did this within the next 24 hours, the hostages would be deported to labor camps. If we did not, they would be shot. I asked how we were to capture, even if we could find them, 3 desperate armed men. He simply looked at his watch and said in German, "It is 11 o'clock. You have until noon tomorrow." At the quay, I was made to repeat in Greek what I had been told. The men all began to shout suggestions, to complain, to demand weapons. In the end, the colonel fired a shot from his pistol in the air, and there was quiet. The roll of the village men was called. Wimmel himself picked out the hostages as they filed forward. I noticed that he picked the healthiest, the ones between 20 and 40, as if he were thinking of the labor camp, but I think that he was choosing the best specimens for death. He chose 79 like that, and then pointed at me. I was the 80th hostage. So the 80 of us were marched off to the school and put under close guard. We were crammed in one classroom, without sanitation, given nothing to eat or drink. Die Raben were guarding us, and even worse, no news. It was only much later that I found out what happened during that time. The remaining men rushed to their homes, poles, sickles, knives. They picked up what they could, and then met again on a hill above the village. Men so old they could hardly walk, boys of 10 and 12. Some women tried to join them, but they were pushed back to be guarantors of their men's return. The sad regiment argued, as Greeks always will. They decided on one plan, then on another. In the end, someone took charge and allotted positions and areas to search. They set out, 120 of them. They were not to know that they were searching in vain even before they began. But even if the guerrillas had been in the pine forest, I do not think they would have found them, let alone captured them. So many trees, so many ravines, so many rocks. They stayed out all night on the hills in a loose cordon across the island, hoping that the guerrillas might try and break through to the village. They searched wildly the next morning. At 10, they met and tried to make up their minds to launch a desperate attack on the troops down in the village. But the wiser heads knew it could only end in an even greater tragedy. There was a village in the Mani where 2 months before the Germans had killed every man, woman, and child for far less provocation. At noon they came carrying a cross and icons down to the village. Wimmel was waiting for them. Their spokesman, an old sailor in a last vain lie, told him they had seen the guerrillas escape in a small boat. Wimmel smiled, shook his head, and had the old man put under arrest. An 81st hostage. What had happened was simple. The Germans themselves had already captured the guerrillas in the village. But let us look at Wimmel. Conchis clapped his hands again. This is him in Athens. One of the resistance groups took it so that we should have his face recorded. The screen filled with light again, a town street. A German jeep-like vehicle drew up in the shade on the opposite side of the street. 3 officers got out and walked in the hard sunlight diagonally. Across the camera, which must have been in the ground floor room of the house next to the one they were entering. The head of someone passing blocked the view. A shorter, trimmer man led the way. I could see he had an air of curt, invincible authority. The other 2 men existed in his wake. Something, a shutter or a screen, obscured the view. Darkness. Then came a still of a man in civilian clothes. That is the only known photograph of him before the war. An unexceptional face, but a mean mouth. I remembered there were other sorts of humorlessness and fixed stare beside consciences, and much more unpleasantness. There was a certain similarity with the face of the colonel on the central ridge, but they were different men. And these are excerpts from newsreels taken in Poland. As they came on, Conchis said, "That is him, behind the general," or Wimmel, on the extreme left. Though I could see the film was genuine, I had the same feeling that films of the Nazis had always given me, of unreality, of the distance, enormous, between a Europe that could breed such monsters and an England that could not. And I felt that Conchis was trying to enweb me, to make me too innocent, too historically green. Yet when I glanced at his face reflected in the light from the screen, he seemed even more absorbed in what he saw than I was myself, more a victim of the past. What the guerrillas must have done is this. As soon as they realized their boat had been burned, they doubled back toward the village. They were probably already only just outside it when Anton came to see me. What we did not know was that one of them had relations on the outskirts of the village, a family called Tsatsos. It consisted of 2 sisters of 18 and 20, a father and a brother. but the men happened to have left 2 days before for the Piraeus with a cargo of olive oil. They had a small caique, and the Germans allowed a certain amount of coastal traffic. One of the guerrillas was a cousin of these girls, probably in love with the elder one. The guerrillas came to the cottage unseen before anyone in the village knew of the catastrophe. They were no doubt counting on using the family caique, but it was away. Later, a weeping neighbor arrived to tell the sisters the news of the killing and all that I had told the village men. By then the guerrillas were in hiding. We do not know where they spent the night, probably in an empty cistern. Parties of hastily constituted vigilantes searched every cottage and villa, empty and lived in the village, including the Satsuses, and found nothing. Whether the girls were simply frightened or usually patriotic, we shall never know. But they had no blood relations in the village, and of course their father and brother were safely out of it. The guerrillas must that next day have decided to split up. At any rate, the girls started baking bread. A sharp-eyed neighbor noticed it and remembered that they had been baking only 2 days before, bread for the brother and father to take on the voyage. Apparently, she did not suspect anything at once, but about 5 o'clock she went to the school and told the Germans. She had 3 relations among the hostages. A squad of D. Robin arrived at the cottage. Only the cousin was there. He threw himself into a cupboard. He heard the 2 girls being struck and screaming. He knew his time was up. So he leaped out, pistol in hand, fired before the Germans could move, and nothing happened. The pistol had jammed. They took the 3 to the school, where they were interrogated. The girls were tortured. The cousin was quickly made to cooperate. 2 hours later, when night had come, he led the way down the coast road to an empty villa, knocked on the shutter, and whispered to his 2 comrades that the sisters had managed to find a boat. As they came through the gate, the Germans pounced. The leader was shot in the arm, but no one else was hurt. I interrupted. And he was a Cretan? Yes, quite like the man you saw, only shorter and broader. All that time, we hostages had been up in the classroom. It faced over the pine forest, so we could not see any of the comings and goings. But about 9, we heard 2 terrible screams of pain, and a fraction later a tremendous cry. The one Greek word, Eleutheria. You may think that we cried in return, but we did not. Instead, we felt hope that the guerrillas had been caught. Not long after that, there were 2 bursts of automatic fire, and sometime after that, the door of our room was thrown open. I was called out, and another man, the local butcher. We were marched downstairs and out in front of the school to the wing where I believe you masters live now, the western. Vimmel was standing at the entrance there with one of his lieutenants. On the side of the steps behind them, the collaborationist interpreter was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked white, in a state of shock. Some 20 yards away by the wall, I saw 2 dead female bodies. Soldiers rolled them onto stretchers as we approached. The lieutenant stepped forward and signaled to the butcher to follow him. Vimmel turned and went into the building. I saw his back going down the dark stone corridor, and then I was pushed forward after him. He stood outside a door at the far end and waited for me. Light poured from it. When I got there, he gestured for me to go in. I think anyone but a doctor would have fainted. I should have liked to have fainted. The room was bare. In the middle was a table. Roped to the table was a young man, the cousin. He was naked except for a blood-stained singlet, and he had been badly burnt about the mouth and eyes. But I could see only one thing. Where his genitals should have been, there was nothing but a black-red hole. They had cut off his penis and scrotal sac with a pair of wire-cutting shears. In one of the far corners, another naked man lay on the floor. His face was to the ground, and I could not see what they had done to him. He, too, was apparently unconscious. I shall never forget the stillness of that room. There were 3 or 4 other soldiers. Soldiers, of course, torturers, psychopathic sadists in the room. One of them held a long iron stake. An electric fire was burning, lying on its back. 3 of the men wore leather aprons like blacksmith's aprons to keep their uniforms clean. There was a disgusting smell of excrement and urine. And there was one other man bound to a chair in the corner. He had been gagged, a great bull of a man, badly bruised and wounded in one arm, but evidently not tortured yet. Vimmel had started first on the ones most likely to break. I have seen films like Rossellini's of the good human's reactions to such scenes, how he turns on the fascist monsters and delivers himself of some terse yet magnificent condemnation, how he speaks for history and humanity and forever puts them in their place. I confess my own feelings were of immediate and intense personal fear. You see, Nicholas, I thought, and Vimmel left a long silence to let me think, that I was now going to be tortured as well. I did not know why, but there was no reason left in the world when human beings could do such things to one another. I turned round and looked at Vimmel. The extraordinary thing was that he seemed the most human other person in the room. He looked tired and angry, even a little disgusted, ashamed at the mess his men had created. He said in English, "These men do this for pleasure. I do not. I wish, before they start on that murderer there, that you will speak to him." I said, "What must I say?" "I want the names of his friends. I want the names of the people who help him. I want the positions of hiding places and arms places. If he gives me these, I give him my word, he will be executed in a correct military manner." I said, "Did they not tell you enough?" Vimmel said, "All they knew, but he knows more. He is a man I have long wished to meet. His friends could not make him speak. I do not think we shall make him speak. Perhaps you can. You will say this, the truth. You do not like us Germans. You are an educated man. Your wish only to stop these procedures. You will advise him to speak what he knows. It is no guilt now that he is caught to speak. You understand? Come with me." We went into another bare room next door. A few moments later, the wounded man was dragged in, still tied to his chair, and set in the center of the room. I was given a chair facing him. The colonel sat in the background and waved the torturers outside. I began to talk. I did exactly as the colonel had ordered. That is, I begged the man to give all the information he could. You will say it was dishonorable of me because you were thinking of the families and other men he could have betrayed. But that night I lived in those 2 rooms. They were the only reality. The outside world did not exist. I felt passionately that it was my duty to stop any more of this atrocious degradation of human intelligence, and that the cretin's obsessive obstinacy seemed to contribute so directly to the degradation that it in part constituted it. I told him I was not a collaborationist, that I was a doctor, that my enemy was human suffering, that I spoke for Greece when I said that God would forgive him if he spoke now. His friends had suffered enough. There was a point beyond which no man could be expected to suffer, and so on. Every argument I could think of. But his expression was one of unchanging hostility to me, hatred of me. I doubt if he even listened to what I was saying. He must have assumed that I was a collaborationist, that all the things I told him were lies. In the end I fell silent and looked back at the colonel. I could not hide the fact that I thought I had failed. He must have signaled to the guards outside because one of them came in, went behind the cretin, and unfastened the gag. At once the man roared, all the cords in his throat standing out. That same word, that one word. Eleutheria. There was nothing noble in it. It was pure savagery, as if he was throwing a can of lighted petrol over us. The guard brutally twisted the gag back over his mouth and retied it. Of course, the word was not for him a concept or an ideal. It was simply his last weapon, and he used it as a weapon. The colonel said, "Take him back and await my orders." The man was dragged away again into that sinister room. The colonel walked to the shuttered window, opened it onto darkness, and stood there for a minute, then turned to me. He said, "Now you see why I must speak the language that I do." I said, "I see nothing any more." Vimmel replied, "Perhaps I should make you watch the dialogue between my men and that animal." I said, "I beg you not to." He asked me if I thought he enjoyed such scenes. I did not answer. Then he said, "I should be very happy to sit at my headquarters, to have nothing to do but sign papers and enjoy the beautiful classical monuments. You do not believe me. You think I am a sadist. I am not. I am a realist." Still, I sat in silence. He planted himself in front of me and said, "You will be placed under guard in a separate room. I will give orders that you have something to eat and drink. As one civilized man to another, I regret the incidents of today and the incidents in the next room. You will not, of course, be one of the hostages." I looked up at him, I suppose, with a shocked gratitude. He said, "You will please remember that, like every other officer, I have only one supreme purpose in my life, the German historical purpose, to bring order into the chaos of Europe. When that is done, then is the time for leader singing." I cannot tell you how, but I knew he was lying. One of the great fallacies of our time is that the Nazis rose to power because they imposed order on chaos. Precisely the opposite is true. They were successful because they imposed chaos on order. They tore up the commandments. They denied the superego, what you will. They said, "You may persecute the minority, you may kill, you may torture, you may couple and breed without love." They offered humanity all its great temptations. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. I believe that, unlike most Germans, Vimmel knew, had always known this, what he was doing, and that he was playing with me. It did not seem so at first. He gave me one last look and then went out, and I heard him speak to one of the guards who had brought me. I was taken to a room on another floor and given something to eat and a bottle of German beer. I had many feelings, but the dominant one was that I was going to survive. I was still going to see the sun shining, to breathe, to eat bread, to touch a keyboard. The night passed. I was brought coffee in the morning, allowed to wash. Then at 10:30 I was made to go out. I found all the other hostages waiting. They had not been given anything to drink or eat, and I was forbidden to speak to them. There was no sign of Vimmel or of Anton. We were marched to the harbor. The entire village was there, some 400 or 500 people, black and gray and faded blue, crammed onto the quays with a line of Dievaben watching them. The village priests, the women, even little boys and girls, they screamed as we came into sight, like some amorphous protoplasm, trying to break bonds, but unable to. We went on marching. There was a large house with huge attic acroteria facing the harbor. You know it? In those days, there was a taverna on the ground floor. On the balcony above, I saw Vimmel, and behind him Anton, flanked by men with machine guns. I was taken from the column and made to stand against the wall under the balcony among the chairs and tables. The hostages went marching on, up a street and out of sight. It was very hot, a perfect blue day. The villagers were driven from the quay to the terrace with the old cannons in front of the taverna. They stood crowded there, brown faces upturned in the sunlight, black kerchiefs of the women fluttering in the breeze. I could not see the balcony, but the colonel waited above, impressing his silence on them, his presence, and gradually they fell absolutely quiet, a wall of expectant faces. Up in the sky I saw swallows and martins, like children playing in a house where some tragedy is taking place among the adults. Strange to see so many Greeks and not a sound. Only the tranquil cries of little birds. Vimmel began to speak. The collaborationist interpreted. You will see now what happens to those who are the enemies of Germany, and to those who help the enemies of Germany. By order of a court-martial of the German High Command held last night, 3 have been executed, 2 more will now be executed. All the brown hands darted up, made the 4 taps of the cross. Vimmel paused. German is to death what Latin is to ritual religion. Entirely appropriate. Following that, the 80 hostages, taken under occupation law, in retaliation for the brutal murder of 4 innocent members of the German armed forces, and yet again he paused, will be executed. When the interpreter interpreted the last phrase, there was an exhaled groan, as if they had all been struck in the stomach. Many of the women, some of the men fell to their knees, imploring the balcony, humanity groping for the non-existent pity of a Deus Vindicans. Vimmel must have withdrawn because the beseechings turned to lamentations. Now I was forced out from the wall and marched after the hostages. Soldiers, the Austrians, stood at every entrance to the harbor and forced the villagers back. It horrified me that they could help D. Robin, could obey Vimmel, could stand there with impassive faces and roughly force back people that I knew only a day or 2 before they did not hate. The alley curved up between the houses to the square beside the village school. It is a natural stage, inclined slightly to the north, with the sea and the mainland over the lower roofs, with the wall of the village school on the uphill side and high walls to east and west. If you remember, there is a large plane tree in the garden of the house to the west. The branches come over the wall. As I came to the square, that was the first thing I saw. 3 bodies hung from the branches, pale in the shadow, as monstrous as Goya etchings. There was the naked body of the cousin with its terrible wound, and there were the naked bodies of the 2 girls. They had been disemboweled. A slit cut from their breastbones down to their pubic hair, and the intestines pulled out. Half-gutted carcasses swaying slightly in the noon wind. Beyond those 3 atrocious shapes I saw the hostages. They had been herded against the school in a pen of barbed wire. The men at the back were just in the shadow of the wall, the front ones in sunlight. As soon as they saw me, they began to shout. There were insults of the obvious kind to me, confused cries of appeal, as if anything I could say then would have touched the colonel. He was there in the center of the square with Anton and some 20 of D. Robin. On the 3rd side of the square to the east there is a long wall. You know it? In the middle a gate, iron grills. The 2 surviving guerrillas were lashed to the bars, not with rope, with barbed wire. I was halted behind the 2 lines of men some 20 yards away from where Vimmel was standing. Anton would not look at me, though Vimmel turned briefly. Anton, staring into space as if he had hypnotized himself into believing that none of what he saw existed, as if he no longer existed himself. The colonel beckoned the collaborationist to him. I suppose he wanted to know what the hostages were shouting. He appeared to think for a moment, and then he went towards them. They fell silent. Of course, they did not know he had already pronounced sentence on them. He said something that was translated to them, what I could not hear, except that it reduced the villagers to silence. So it was not the death sentence. The colonel marched back to me. He said, I have made an offer to these peasants. I looked at his face. It was absolutely without nervousness, excitation, a man in complete command of himself. He went on, I will permit them not to be executed, to go to a labor camp on one condition, that is that you, as mayor of this village, carry out in front of them the execution of the 2 murderers. I said, I'm not an executioner. The village men began to shout frantically at me. He looked at his watch and said, "You have 30 seconds to decide." Of course, in such situations one cannot think. All coherence is crowded out of one's mind. You must remember this. From this point on, I acted without reason, beyond reason. I said, "I have no choice." He went to the end of one of the ranks of men in front of me. He took a submachine gun from a man's shoulder, appeared to make sure that it was correctly loaded, then came back with it and presented it to me with both hands, as if it was a prize I had won. The hostages cheered, crossed themselves, and then were silent. The colonel watched me. I had a wild idea that I might turn the gun on him, but of course the massacre of the entire village would then have been inevitable. I walked toward the men, wired to the iron gates. I knew why he had done this. It would be widely publicized by the German-controlled newspapers. The pressure on me would not be mentioned, and I would be presented as a Greek who cooperated in the German theory of order, a warning to other mayors, an example to other frightened Greeks everywhere. But those 80 men, how could I condemn them? I came within about 15 feet of the two guerrillas, so close because I had not fired a gun for very many years. For some reason I had not looked them in the face till then. I had looked at the high wall with its tiled top, at a pair of vulgar ornamental urns on top of the pillars that flanked the gate, at the fronds of a pepper tree beyond. But then I had to look at them. The younger of the two might have been dead. His head had fallen forward. They had done something to his hands. I could not see what, but there was blood all over the fingers. He was not dead. I heard him groan, mutter something. He was delirious. And the other, his mouth had been struck or kicked. The lips were severely contused, reddened. As I stood there and raised the gun, he drew back what remained of those lips. All his teeth had been smashed in. The inside of his mouth was like a blackened vulva. But I was too desperate to finish to realize the real cause. He, too, had had his fingers crushed or his nails torn out, and I could see multiple burns on his body. But the Germans had made one terrible error. They had not gouged out his eyes. I raised the gun blindly and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. A click. I pressed it again, and again. An empty click. I turned and looked round. Vimmel and my two guards were standing 20 feet or so away, watching. The hostages suddenly began to call. They thought I had lost the will to shoot. I turned back and tried once more. Again, nothing. I turned to the colonel and gestured with the gun to show that it would not fire. I felt faint in the heat, nausea, yet unable to faint. He said, "Is something wrong?" I answered, "The gun will not fire." "It is a Schmeisser, an excellent weapon. I have tried 3 times. It will not fire because it is not loaded. It is strictly forbidden for the civilian population to possess loaded weapons." I stared at him, then at the gun, still not understanding. The hostages were silent again. I said very helplessly, "How can I kill them?" He smiled, a smile as thin as a saber slash. Then he said, "I am waiting." I understood then. I was to club them to death. I understood many things, his real self, his real position, and from that came the realization that he was mad, and that he was therefore innocent, as all mad people, even the most cruel, are innocent. He was what life could do if it wanted, an extreme possibility, most hideously mind and flesh. Perhaps that was why he could impose himself so strongly, like a black divinity, for there was something superhuman in the spell he cast, and therefore the real evil, the real monstrosity in the situation lay in the other Germans, those less than mad lieutenants and corporals and privates who stood silently there, watching this exchange. I walked toward him. The 2 guards thought I was going to attack him because they sharply raised their guns, but he said something to them and stood perfectly still. I stopped some 6 feet from him. We stared at each other. "I beg you, in the name of European civilization, to stop this barbarity, and I command you to continue this punishment." Without looking down, he said, Refusal to carry out this order will result in your own immediate execution. I walked back over the dry earth to that gate. I stood in front of those two men. I was going to say to the one who seemed capable of understanding that I had no choice. I must do this terrible thing to him, but I left a fatal pause of a second to elapse. Perhaps because I realized, close to him, what had happened to his mouth. It had been burnt, not simply bludgeoned or kicked. I remembered that man with the iron stake, the electric fire. They had broken in his teeth and branded his tongue, burnt his tongue right down to the roots with red-hot iron. That word he had shouted must finally have driven them beyond endurance, and in those astounding 5 seconds, the most momentous of my life, I understood this guerrilla. I mean that I understood far better than he did himself what he was. He helped me. He managed to stretch his head toward me and say the word he could not say. It was almost not a sound, but a contortion in his throat, a 5-syllabled choking. But once again, one last time, it was unmistakably that word, and the word was in his eyes, and the word was in his eyes, in his being, totally in his being. What did Christ say on the cross? Why hast thou forsaken me? What this man said was something far less sympathetic, far less pitiful, even far less human, but far profounder. He spoke out of a world the very opposite of mine. In mine, life had no price. It was so valuable that it was literally priceless. In his, only one last thing had that quality of pricelessness. It was eleutheria, freedom. He was the immalleable, the essence, the beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond civilization, beyond history. He was not God, because there is no God we can know, but he was a proof that there is a God that we can never know. He was the final right to deny, to be free to choose. He, or what manifested itself through him, even included the insane Wimmel, the despicable German and Austrian troops. He was every freedom, from the very worst to the very best. The freedom to desert on the battlefield of Neuve-Chapelle, the freedom to confront a primitive god at Saidavar, the freedom to disembowel peasant girls and castrate with wire cutters. He was something that passed beyond morality, but sprang out of the very essence of things, that comprehended all, the freedom to do all, and stood against only one thing, the prohibition not to do all. And I have said nothing about how I felt this immalleability, this refusal to cohere, was essentially Greek. That is, I finally assumed my Greekness. All I saw in a matter of seconds, perhaps not in time at all, saw that I was the only person left in that square who had the freedom left to choose, and that the enunciation and defense of that freedom was more important than common sense. Self-preservation, yes, than my own life, than the lives of the 80 hostages. Again and again since then, those 80 men have risen in the night and accused me. You must remember that I was certain I was going to die too, but all I have to set against their crucified faces are those few transcendent seconds of knowledge. But knowledge, like a white heat. My reason had repeatedly told me I was wrong, yet my total being still tells me I was right. I stood there perhaps 15 seconds. I could not tell you. Time means nothing in such situations. And then I dropped the gun and stepped beside the guerrilla leader. I saw the colonel watching me, and I said, for him, and so also for the remnant of a man beside me to hear, the one word that remained to be said. Somewhere beyond Wimmel, I saw Anton moving, walking quickly toward him, but it was too late. The colonel spoke, the submachine guns flashed, and I closed my eyes at exactly the moment the first bullets hit